Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Arthur Invests. Excited to be with you. I was getting some content prepared for a meeting I'm having with a customer here in my day job, and it sparked me with an idea of something I wanted to share with you. It's this idea of blast radius, and so I'll kind of go over this idea with you conceptually, and then we'll talk about how practically that might work in your day-to-day life. So in tech, there's this idea that you want to try to understand your blast radius in the event that there's some sort of disaster with your technology stack, so to speak, right? Your website or infrastructure. If for some reason there's a crash or your data center goes out or something of that nature, you want to be able to predict and have systems in place to be able to minimize how bad that quote unquote blast radius is, right? So if it were to picture a data center blowing up in some ways, you want to be able to minimize the impact of that on your customer's experience and your revenue, right? So that you have tools and strategies in place to be able to minimize the impact potentially of what that will do to disrupt your overall business. And I think that's kind of an interesting model because when we think about personal finance or investing in assets, this is kind of the same strategy. The whole reason we do this is because we want to create a way to protect or insulate ourselves, to almost like an insurance policy, to be able to have something if we need it, to be able to go to the well. So what I would like to propose is three things that I'd like to share with you that will absolutely help you feel more confident about withstanding any type of big windfall, positive or negative, any type of unforeseen crisis like we just went through in COVID. And I could probably share a couple of examples and some other tools that you can do to feel more confident in your day to day and sleep a little better at night, at least things that have worked for me. So I'll go with the first one, cash reserves. Look, I know that everybody these days says cash is trash. And when you look at the level of inflation we're starting to see in society, it's not lost on me that the devaluation of the dollar is actively happening in front of us. But cash can solve a lot of problems. And I'll always be one of those investors that over indexes on being a little bit more conservative and cash heavy than one that's leveraged to the hill. I always like to try to maintain a 30% to 40% minimum equity position in all the assets I own. I just, the guys that are leveraged to 90%, they might have more units, but I can tell you that I sleep way better than they do at the end of the day. So I would say cash reserves. And if you're trying to understand, how much you need, that's it. That's at every person's discretion. I know the banks want to see at least 6 months reserves. And I actually don't think that's a bad way to start. In fact, I would say if you're just starting out and you're getting your first property, hang on to 6 months worth of reserves. Do a year if you feel comfortable with it. And then the longer you own the property, you can whittle down that amount and you start to get a sense of what repairs look like, how much damage comes in. And as you start to acquire more property, I think now we really, we try to have money in the bank to support the windfalls that come in when repairs need to happen. But it gets replenished pretty quick now because you have enough volume of coming in of rents that gets backfilled pretty quickly. So I would just say, start off a little high, but make sure you have enough to last any type of storm that's there. And 6 months is a great way to do it. Another thing to think about with cash reserves, and I just thought of this, so I guess this is the fourth thing, is you might want to think about restructuring your lease agreements a bit, right? And so I know traditionally we've liked to do, 12 months or maybe, 24 months if you can find a tenant who wants to lock in that rate for 2 years. But I think that we've seen over the past year that, it's an interesting time to be a landowner and a landlord specifically. And with the government reaching out and interjecting itself into contracts the way that they have with lease agreements and CDC eviction memorandums, you have to kind of be a little bit creative. So I will propose to you two quick action items and then we'll skip to the other two ways you can insulate yourself here. You may want to think about 6 month lease agreements with an option to extend. That's one way you can work with your tenants. And it's just to kind of, it's good for you, it's a good for me type thing. I like that because no matter where you're at in the cycle, if they've collected a few months of rent and they're going to be bad, you always know you're only within a few, maybe a quarter of being able to to find a new tenant, so to speak. If they're not fulfilling their end of the commitment, then you don't then you don't have to fulfill your end of the commitment, right? And that's kind of a nice clean break. And the other option you can think of is a month-to-month agreement, right? That sometimes tenants get a little hesitant about that, but I think in this market that may work to your advantage because you're able to, there's so much demand where I think people would be willing to stick with it, and maybe even enforces them to help, encourages them to stay on time with the payments. So, those are two options to consider. So first off, cash reserves. I think that was the first way you can kind of minimize your blast radius when investing in property. Second piece, just in general, as a good life strategy, and I learned this pretty early, is try to think about how to acquire multiple streams of income. And this is not necessarily just from an investment standpoint, although I primarily focus on that. But let me give you some examples. Cash flowing real estate. That's a great place to create another multiple. That's another stream of income. It's passive. That's great. But another thing that's become more and more popular is side hustles, right? This idea of maybe driving for Uber on the evenings, or if you have a business idea that you're cooking up in the nighttime, with your significant other or a friend or by yourself, like, does that have legs? Can you do that while still holding your day job? And so that's another way to think about it. The type of work you go after. Is there, if you have a 401k match, that is another stream of income. Why is that another stream of income, Arthur? I can't touch that till I'm in my retirement years. Well, you can actually borrow against your 401k if you run into a pinch, right? So that is an income stream here. Your company's matching it 3 to 6%. That's resources that you can tap into. And we're talking about a disaster recovery scenario, right? Something goes bad, you want to have multiple levers to pull from. And another thing to think about is if you're looking for employment, there's stock options, RSUs. That's a new thing for me. I've just gotten into big tech in the last 5 years, and RSUs are a huge part of the compensation package. And that's something that you can get without doing any additional work. That's just part of your day job. And so that's another thing to consider, your spouse, obviously. But if there's any other pieces that you can think about, try to understand what are some other ways you can have multiple streams of income. In the event that something else dries up, you have a backfill there. So think about multiple streams of income. And the third piece, and this is going to be a little bit more specific to real estate investing, research. What do you mean research? Research. Keep your eye on the ball. Now, I happen to love this stuff, right? I can read articles about real estate and market demographic changes and projections towards the future. It seems like it's almost a pastime for me to try to predict what's going to happen 6 to 12 months out. But it's something that I'm pretty focused on. I spend about 15 minutes a day reading articles and listening to podcasts. It's just something that I enjoy doing. But at the very minimum, try to keep an eye on your market where you're invested. The demographics changing? Are they changing for the better, for the worse? What's happening in the economy? What's going on with your career and your job? Are you feeling stable and secure? Like these types of things, trying to ask yourself the predictive questions. What is the worst case scenario in 6 months? What's the best case scenario? And always kind of having these gut checks and doing the research to make sure that you're not ever caught off guard. This doesn't mean that you're not going to get caught off guard, but what it does do is it puts you in a posture to set up systems and protocols in your life where you can go back to either cash reserves if you need to, or pull money out of your 401k, or pull a line of credit on your house if you had to. Like, do you know where those levers are? And that's a great way to be able to kind of minimize some of the anxiety and stress, especially if you're just getting started. And I'll close with this story and then hopefully wrap up here. At the beginning of COVID, we were pretty freaked out. We didn't know where this was going to go. We have a good amount of property now. And if all the tenants collectively decide to rent strike or the government intervenes, we have quite a bit of debt obligations we got to commit to every month. And you only cover your debt if your tenants are paying you, right? Because you've made the initial investment in the asset and now you've had a whole business model calculated against this. But part of the business model is having cash reserves. So we had, I think, a couple of houses paid off, and we actually ended up refinancing and pulling money out of those properties. So we had, again, that first layer, cash just made us very, very adequate to kind of go through this last year. We ended up having more, it sounds like I'm bragging, but it's not. We just ended up having a surplus of cash this last year where we were not planning on deploying that much, and just because we got through COVID and we sat for about 8 months without any type of movement. In fact, because we primarily buy single families, almost all of our tenants were performing early too. And we had no problem backfilling any vacancies. And so we just had all this cash. We had to put it back into the market. And it actually started a great trend. Now we really reconsolidated our debt and paid off a couple of other houses. So it actually worked out really well for us. But my point in saying that is, like, you need to have levers. I had already thought through that 2 or 3 years ago, that in the event of a worst case scenario, we would re-leverage these properties. So we had a defensive strategy. And so if I was in a situation where maybe I lost my job or some other thing happened, we always had a way with those houses to be able to support ourselves. So anyway, those are some 3-prongs approach and a couple of little nuggets there peppered in. I hope you enjoyed that. If you have any thoughts, criticisms, feedback, feel free to hit the like and subscribe button and comment down below. Talk to you soon. Take care.